All right, so we will jump. What do you think? We'll want to jump into the movie of the week first.
Yes.
All right, well, here we go. All right, so yes, movie of the week. Alrighty, so what are we talking about this week, Caleb?
I think we're talking about little, a minuscule trilogy. Really kind of an indie flick. Um, I think it's called The Lord of the Rings.
All right, so as you can tell, if you've ever heard Caleb preach, Lord of the Rings is pretty dear to his heart. Although
Yes.
because we're sophisticated folk, we're actually probably going to be talking about the books more than the movies, and so I feel like when we do this portion of the podcast, it might sort of run along the same lines as if I kind of started a series on the Grace Nerd channel called Christian Ish. And the first
Hmm.
movie I covered was Bruce Almighty. And really, I just asked the question, how Christian was this movie? And I talked about the themes of the movie overall. And then I talked about some of the details because, like, there is a deity figure in that movie. And there's actually some pretty theological claims. And so I was able to sort of run those against scripture and stuff like that. I guess we could kind of do that with Lord of the Rings. It's more of a touchstone in our culture, really. And we know a lot about the author. And so, from your perspective, and from what you've heard from Tolkien, how did he feel about the connection or lack of connection between Christianity and Lord of the Rings? Because I know, like, him and C.S. Lewis had different opinions on, like, allegory and things like that.
Yeah. I think the standard answer that I've come across is that he did not feel that it was Christian allegory. Um, and that's kind of been the standard thing that I've seen in quotes and people discussing it. For him, this was a story. This was, a work of creativity and a work of art and all of that wonderful stuff. He did not intend for it to be taken as Christian allegory. Now, as of recent, I wish I would have written this down or saved the link somewhere. I didn't realize at the time that it could have been pertinent. I did stumble across an article that seemed to point to a quote where he kind of, I guess, gave in to the idea that yes, it was Christian allegory, but I can't really confirm that 100% because, it was something I read several weeks back and, I can't quote any source for that. So take that for what it's worth. But I think the overall consensus that I've read from quote from him and from others speaking on that topic, he didn't really personally feel it was Christian allegory.
Yeah, so even that being said, I feel like when I talk about fiction, I try to always look at the authorial intent and like the
Hmm.
worldview, at least as far as we know it. I feel like it is kind of inevitable, though, that the worldview of whoever creates a thing, it's going to leak in intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah.
And so, like, I think it's pretty clear that there's like just certain morality themes or like things that clearly, if you are a Christian, they strike you in a certain way. You know, now it's really in sort of more of a broad Christian sense, you might say. I mean, obviously, like we're pretty conservative Protestants, but he was a Roman Catholic, and so like, but it's broad enough that like you wouldn't. It's none of that would be relevant to the themes of Lord of the Rings. It's like it's such a the themes are that broad, but like
Yeah.
I think for me, like one of the things I noticed like that pops out in terms of the story is the nature of the ring itself. Like,
Hmm.
if you ask the question to a Christian, what is sin? Is it something inside of us, or is it something outside of us? We talk about the world, the flesh, and the devil, things like that. But the ring, it seems to touch all of those elements. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
does that make sense?
It does because I mean, from my take on it, the ring kind of pulls and accelerates and exaggerates what's inside. In the movie account, and I believe in the book as well, Gandalf the Wise, the wizard, he rejects the ring, because, of course, he would desire to do great things with it, but through him it would wield evil that no one could, handle. Of course, I'm brutally paraphrasing that, but he rejects it because he knows that the ring
Well, we know what we
pull
call
out
it.
what is within.
We know what you call it when you misquote Lord of the Rings, right?
Heresy? No.
Blasphemy!
You had that ready to go.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Anyways, continue.
Yeah, so I think in that way it does touch on a lot of the reality of sin. You said the world of flesh and the devil. There are outside forces, but of course there are the internal forces of sin. We talk often at Grace Life and just our theological conversations between you and I about the sin nature, we are bent towards sin. We're born in original sin, and we are bent towards sin. That's one way to understand the sinful nature. Another way to talk about it, we talked even recently about total depravity and how that means that humanity is corrupted. Not that we are as utterly evil as we can be, but there's no part of our lives that has not been corrupted by sin, so much so that even the good we desire to do is often with wrong motivations. And I think that may be what the character Gandalf is kind of alluding to when he talks about desiring to do good with it, and yet through him it would wield terrible evil. And so because humanity is corrupt, every facet of our being has been corrupted. Again, not that we are utterly evil or as evil as we can be, but we've all been corrupted by it. Even our motivations are wrong. So I think there's definitely some good parallels there.
Mm-hmm. Any all right. So do any other themes, do you think, jump out to you as you read the book? Like, well, what I know, like, what themes do you tackle? Are there any themes you think you tackle when you're about to give a sermon that, oh boy, I know Lord of the Rings is going to probably come up here?
It feels like, I think when we did a series on the first 25 Psalms, I feel like it came up at least 8 times. And I think several times even in First John, a series we just concluded. And yeah, so I think for me, like, when I'm thinking through the themes of Lord of the Rings, or when I'm, preparing a message and my brain immediately like goes to Lord of the Rings, I often think of, in the story of the Lord of the Rings, there's obviously a very clear villain, a very clear evil, and there is this hero, and there really are multiple heroes. I mean, I think you could really show different themes through all characters like Gandalf. You could show it through Aragorn. You could show it through Frodo. One of my favorite is actually Samwise. I think, and I think Tolkien actually addressed this. Sam is really the hero of the story. And so there's a lot with Samwise, I think, that comes out in themes of hope in the midst of darkness. That really kind of comes through in the book of First John. In fact, in First John, it says that the light is already pushing back the darkness, which to me echoes, or I should say the opposite. Something Sam says echoes that, especially in the movie. This is more of a movie reference here, but he talks at the end of the Two Towers how just when it seemed it couldn't get any darker, that there was something worth fighting for. There was a hope that he had. And so that, that's, I think, a very thematic thing that you can use as an illustration. Now, all Lord of the Rings illustrations fall woefully short when it comes to understanding the gospel, but I do find that they can be helpful and have proven themselves to be helpful in many ways to highlight the gospel. They're not the gospel, but they can paint a nice picture.
Yeah,
One else. Go ahead.
That last part, the darkness being pushed back, that reminds me sort of, as you think about sort of the conclusion of Lord of the Rings, it does remind me of the way we talk about the way the gospel breaks into the world. Now, I suppose your eschatology is going to paint the way you sort of see this playing out, but we talk about the already and the not yet. When you think about more, now I think you'd have to talk more about the book for this to be clearer, in terms of the scouring of the Shire and things like that. But the ring is destroyed, but then there's this sort of moving back into the world and discovering the ways that remnants of what has happened still need to be dealt with. Now, we still have probably conversations to have in the future about end times, but like as a post-millennial myself who believes in progressive victory of Christ in the world, I suppose that lines up with that pretty well. Although there's some who think that, I think as Doug Wilson makes fun of them, he talks about pre-mills. Like, do you think it's going to be like leaven in a loaf, or do you think it's going to be like the first airborne coming in to rescue us all in the darkest hour? But that's a whole nother discussion. Alrighty. So, anything else before we move into trivia time?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in general, one of the reasons that I'm always drawn towards references from Tolkien, specifically Lord of the Rings, but I actually dove a little bit into the Silmarillion for a reference this past Sunday.
I tried. I even tried with an audiobook, but it's tough.
It's a tough read, and I think where I've landed with it is you have to be extremely motivated. And when I was in high school and discovered Lord of the Rings for the first time, I was extremely motivated, and I got through that book very quickly. And I haven't read it. I haven't read the Silmarillion again. I recently just picked up another copy of it and started to read through it, and I was like, oh boy, am I really ready for this? But I think for me, what I really am constantly drawn to with references to Tolkien and just the movies, the books, whichever kind of seems to fit the theme for the day, is really this attention towards hope. You know, I find that to me is very appealing in general. You know, it's a very dark tale at times, you know, especially the Lord of the Rings. You know, there's a lot of dark elements, but the reality of hope and having that set before them never really fades completely. There are moments when it seems to fade out a bit, but never completely. And I think that there's a lot of parallels there to Christianity, just in general. But that's one of the reasons I constantly come back to it. And I know, you know, what I said about Sam, I was talking about hope, and that is, I guess, what really draws me towards it. I can think of, you know, multiple times where that's kind of really fit the theme of what I've used as an illustration. One of my favorite, I actually used a video clip of it, was to talk about the moment when Frodo and Sam are gonna rush the Black Gate. I used the clip from the movie when this happens in the movie, and they stumble down, and Frodo gets stuck in the gravel, and Sam rushes down, and he throws the cloak over them, and it hides them perfectly from the eyes of the human forces that are entering into the Black Gate there to join up with Sauron, and they're perfectly hidden by this. And I used that as a illustration with one of my messages, and somebody came up to me afterwards, and you know, of course they said, you know, they really appreciated that, and they said that it was the illustration that actually made them able to connect the dots between what I was saying. And that's one of the things I love about it. You know, I kind of become known as the Lord of the Rings guy, but at the same time, it does actually help people to grab onto the theology that is being proclaimed in the sermon. And so it'd probably come back more often than not.